All right, so just a little fun with the minimum wage story. I want to open by saying that I'm not sure a $15 minimum wage is the best thing for Mississippi, uh, although I understand the emphasis behind it. $15 in minimum wage would actually raise the minimum wage in Mississippi to the 80th percentile of pay in Mississippi. And in other states, we've seen that maybe hasn't worked out so well. Which is not to say that there's this overwhelming consensus that minimum wages in and of themselves are bad. So let's talk a little bit about where minimum wages are around the world, and sort of a popular misconception about what economists will often say about minimum wages. Just to start, this plot looks at movements in minimum wage relative to the median wage. The median wage is the wage that the absolute middle of the road working person in the country makes. So the minimum wage relative to the median wage in the United States has actually been going down. That's down here at the absolute bottom. Most countries, it's kind of moved up, right? So it's in the United States, the minimum wage is about 33% of the median wage, whereas up in Britain and South Korea and all these places, it's well over 50%. The normal story for people that have kind of gone through introductory microeconomics is to say, well, look, if the price of something goes up, that means the demand for something must go down. Sort of that normal supply and demand chart. The idea being that higher prices for labor, wages, will depress demand for labor. The challenge with that is that labor is not like a lot of commodities, in that the people who are paid for the labor are also the people that are purchasing other stuff. And what ends up in the fudge that economists will frequently introduce is something called a shift in the demand curve. The problem with most interpretations of microeconomics is that it's very difficult to tell if a particular change in price is because of a movement along the curve or a shift in the curve itself. Some economics books and some microeconomics courses are going to go into this particular distinction, and there'll be a lot of professors wiggling their Scooby-Doo fingers about how to tell the difference. The truth is, of course, there is no way to tell the difference because at no point in time does anyone state the demand curve. They just try to estimate it based on what they can see. So what might happen with a change in the minimum price for labor is that because people who are paid for their labor are also the people who are buying other stuff, is a shift in the demand curve, because now I've got higher wages, I'll actually buy more stuff, which might actually increase demand for wages across the board. If it shifts along the supply curve, if it's a normal shift, like what you would read about in level 1 economics, it would result in a lower quantity demanded, so less demand for wages. Of course, unfortunately, they'll have these sort of fudge factors, which means that it might actually be not bad. In other situations, there's probably a balance. Okay, so in places like Washington, where they implemented a $15 minimum wage in the city, it led to people being paid more per hour, but there was this experience that many of them had their wages cut, their hours cut. So for a normal person, the take-home wage was actually not higher. Now, of course, they had more opportunities to go off and do other activities, like maybe other wage activities. But the experience from when they surveyed and looked at paychecks was that most people from the higher pay per hour did not end up taking home more pay. The other bit is, when you raise the price for labor, it also makes automation more attractive. Higher capital spending is good for the long-term health of the economy, because it raises the base level of efficiency in the economy. One story about why higher minimum wage may actually benefit the economy long-term is that it would reduce demand for labor, increase demand for automation, and thus increase this basis level of efficiency. The outcome of that, of course, would be a very sharp short-term downturn in labor demand. So that would actually be probably not politically feasible. But you got to understand that a higher minimum wage is going to raise the attractiveness of automation and machines, and thus reduce the price and interest in labor. The other counterexample here was the Obamacare implementation. So you've got now anybody that works 30 hours a week or more had to be provided with health insurance. There was some people who would shift around and try to keep people from crossing over that threshold. But at the same time, you didn't see a huge increase in inflation. You didn't see a big increase in prices because of that implementation, which kind of makes the story that maybe it's not, maybe those cost increases were not as big a threat as they ended up being. If you were to kind of look at the math on it, um, on a normal hamburger, wages is about 10% of the cost of the burger. So a 10% increase in the cost of the labor would be a 1% increase in the cost of the burger if there were um, sort of the same markup applied to the cost as it was before. That said, um, margins are very, very tight in many industries, and a 1% increase in the actual cost might mean, because if a margin's 4%, a 1% increase in the cost of the burger might leave a 25% reduction in the overall margin in the product. So you almost certainly have to see some sort of increase in prices across the board to get to that. Whether or not it's meaningful across the entire economy is still not entirely clear. Of course, there is an argument, higher minimum wages get people back into the workforce. The participation rate in the U.S. workforce is at an all-time low. It was on a long-term decline even before the pandemic started, but we need to get more people back in the economy, back working. So it's only like 60% of people in the country actually work, and the other 40% are at home, old, disabled, children, etc. And it's not a lot of people that actually work to support all of those other people. And that's not good for the long-term economy either. All right, so there's no probably easy answer here, and there'll often have to be some sort of balance. A big sticker shock would be problematic. Florida introduced a $15 minimum wage, but they've given themselves something like a decade to get there. That may not, they may decide to accelerate that, or the problem with sort of long windows for implementation is it also gives them a lot of opportunity to not. It might be easier to set a standard wage now and just tie it to inflation going forward. That'll put a lot of discussion about how to calculate inflation, but it would also reduce this sort of, I don't know, quadrennial debate about what the minimum wage should be and whether or not it should be the same across the country or not. It's certainly the case that it's more costly to live in San Francisco than it is in Mississippi. The challenge is, like, how much more expensive is pretty bloody hard to measure.